Hi everyone and welcome back. Okay, so today it's going to be a watercolour. I'm going to be using some black ink, so I guess you could call it pen and wash, ink and wash, whatever. The paper that I'm using for this one is Arch's £140 cold pressed watercolour paper, and I'll put a link in the description below of all the materials I use for this. I use some black waterproof Indian ink, a set of Pilot drawing pens for the fine detail, and a small number 2 paintbrush, and that's it. I used a small selection of colours from the Cotman range, the Winsor & Newton Professional range, and the Sennelier watercolours as well. I'll talk more about the colour mixes and all that kind of stuff over on Patreon, where there'll be 2 full-length versions of this for you to see. I also painted 5 versions of this, 5 paintings in total. 2 of them are put into time-lapse because they were just sort of practice pieces, but the other 3, there's a full-time version over on Patreon, so you can see all 3 of them, all done in real time, with real-time narration and everything. And I'll leave links to Patreon in the end screen and in the description below as well. Now this one I've done specifically for beginners. As long as you can draw reasonably well and you can get the outlines of the bench, the tree and the figure in there, which I'll show you how to do all that over on Patreon. There's also a graphite drawing version of this where I talk more about the drawing process, which is again very easy to do. So once you've got the line drawing down, all you need to do is just ink all the line work in, fill in all the lines and everything for the branches, and we're left with this really nice dark black foreground, all nicely silhouetted, ready to paint the sunset in the background. Now this really is a good one to do for beginners, particularly those just starting out with watercolour, because the watercolour part of this is simplicity itself. It's just a very simple, basic wet into wet technique, so you've not got to worry too much about shapes or anything like that. We're basically just letting the watercolour do the work. We'll be wetting the paper all over to start with, and then just applying the colours and just let them do their thing. I mean, they work fantastically on their own when you don't mess about with them, so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to let them just kind of run around on the paper. Obviously we're going to sort of help them a little bit, we're going to lay them down in the right place, but because they're going into wet paper, we'll get some nice soft diffuse edges there, which will represent, clouds and nice, soft shapes and everything in the sky. So the actual process of the watercolour is very, very easy, very easy. And the fact that I'm doing this on an A5 size piece of paper, I'm keeping it on a small scale, which basically means the process of the watercolour will be very easy to control. Once we start getting onto a larger scale of paper, the watercolour becomes a little bit tricky to handle, for beginners. But on a small scale, it's very easy to control. We've got to think of things like the paper drying out before we've got all of the washes on there, and on a smaller scale we can fill that area in quicker before the water actually dries, which gives us a lot more working time, which is a lot easier for beginners to cope with. So if you're okay at drawing and you don't have any problems with that, and you've been curious about watercolours, you want to give them a try, but it might look a little bit tricky or complicated for you, a scene like this will be absolutely ideal. If you can draw this foreground in, like I say, the watercolour part really is simplicity itself. The only thing we've really got to worry about here is making sure that the black ink that we use is waterproof. I mean, you can even use a Sharpie if you want to. The thing is, if you do use a Sharpie, you must leave it a good few minutes for the solvents to evaporate, because for some reason it doesn't react very well when you brush water or colour over it. Kind of forms a halo effect around the line, but if you let the solvents dry out and you give it a good brush over with water, you won't have any problem with it. But like I say, I'm using black Indian ink, which is waterproof, and I'm using these Pilot drawing pens, which are absolutely brilliant. I've got a small set of them, I'll link them in the description below, but you'll certainly need some sort of waterproof fine liner black ink pen, to do these grasses and to do the twigs. And fine details on the tree and everything. Also very useful as well, just for straightening up the lines. straightening up lines on the bench and just altering the shapes a little bit on the figure. You know, they're really good for making those sort of final adjustments and everything. Now, a painting like this won't take you too long. I think it took me about an hour, probably a little bit over. I mean, I'm a very slow worker anyway when it comes to artwork. I always like to take my time and, you know, drag the process out as long as I can. But it shouldn't take you too long. You know, it's not like one of my 30 to 50 hour graphite drawings or anything like that. This really can be done within an hour, hour and a half. You know, once you've got that line drawing down, the actual filling in of the ink and the watercolour is quite a fast process, but I must admit the twigs and everything, the branches, do take a little bit of time, and that's probably where the bulk of the time is. Okay, so now the ink drawing's completed, I'll just let that dry for a little while just to make sure it's thoroughly dry before I actually apply any water over it. You know, I don't want any smudges or anything like that, or any lines bleeding out into the washes, so just make sure it's thoroughly dry, you know, before we actually start this process. I'm using a size 14 sable brush for this. In fact, I only used 2 paintbrushes for the whole thing, the size 14 round, and I think it was a 1/2 inch flat that I used for this, and that was it. So the whole painting uses very few materials. I think the total amount of colours I used was only 4 or 5. So very minimal equipment required for this one. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll talk more about the colour mixing and all that kind of stuff over on Patreon. In fact, you actually see the palette on Patreon, so you can actually see the consistency of the paint that I'm mixing and all that kind of thing. Okay, so what I'll do now, I'll leave you to watch the rest of the video in peace. And don't forget, I'll leave I'll leave links in the description below of the materials that I use, and to my Patreon channel as well. And there'll be a link to Patreon in the end screen cards. It'd be fantastic to see you over there. A wonderful community of people there, really supportive, friendly people. You'll be made more than welcome. It'd be great to see you over there. Okay, so I'll let you watch the rest of the video in peace now. Thanks very much for watching. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.